Hi, one. You probably wouldn't believe me if I told you that the moment my mother shouted those words, pack your things, my entire world shifted in ways I could have never anticipated. But that's exactly how it happened, and even as I sit here trying to put it into words, I still feel that sting in my chest, the echo of her voice bouncing against the walls of the house that I had called home for so many years, a house that suddenly felt like it wasn't mine anymore, like I had been a guest overstaying my welcome. And the strange part was that I wasn't even surprised. Not really, because for months the air in that house had been growing heavier, conversations sharper, and the distance between us stretched wider until it felt like we lived in two separate worlds under one roof. So when she yelled it, I froze for just a second. Then something in me clicked, something that whispered, maybe this is your chance. Maybe this is the moment you stop pretending everything's fine. And that's when I quietly went to my room, shut the door, and started folding my clothes into a suitcase with a steadiness that felt both terrifying and liberating. Because each shirt and pair of jeans I folded was like a piece of myself being reclaimed from the chaos. And as I packed, I thought about all the late night arguments, the slammed doors, the accusations that I wasn't grateful enough, that I was selfish, that I didn't understand the sacrifices made for me. And in that moment, I realized I had been carrying not just my belongings, but years of guilt and expectation piled onto my shoulders, so much so that I barely remembered who I was without them. And with every item I put into that bag, I imagined setting down a piece of that weight, freeing myself in increments, and even though I knew walking out wouldn't be easy, there was a strange fire in my chest, a sense of defiance that I had never allowed myself to feel before, because usually I bit my tongue, apologized first, did whatever it took to restore the uneasy peace in that house. But not this time, not after those words, because the way she said them, with finality and anger, told me this wasn't a temporary flare-up. This was her trying to push me out, to test if I would crumble. But I wasn't going to crumble, not anymore. So I zipped that suitcase and sat on the bed for a while, my heart racing, my hands trembling, yet inside me a quiet voice repeating, "This is it. This is your turning point." And as I stared around the room at the posters on the wall, the books stacked in the corner, the half-burned candle on the nightstand, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Because I knew I was leaving more than just objects behind. I was leaving behind a version of myself that had always bent under the weight of expectations, and stepping into a version of me that, while scared and unsure, was finally willing to stand up and walk away, even if it meant burning bridges, even if it meant facing uncertainty. Because anything felt better than living in that endless cycle of blame and resentment. And I didn't realize it fully then, but packing my things was only the first act. The real rebellion came later, in a way I never planned, in the moment I decided to cancel the Autopay for their bills. A decision that even now shocks people when I tell them. But in that first moment, all I felt was a strange mix of fear and freedom. And it began with those 4 words, echoing like a challenge, pack your things. Hartuhi, when I finally walked out of that room with my suitcase in hand, the silence in the house was louder than any words that had ever been spoken, and I remember pausing in the hallway, staring at the family photos lining the walls, pictures of birthdays where we smiled like nothing was wrong, vacations where we pretended we were a happy family, moments frozen in time that now felt like lies taped inside frames, and I couldn't help but wonder if my mother ever looked at those pictures and felt the same hollowness that I did, or if she still believed in the story they told. But my chest tightened with the thought that maybe she never cared about what I felt in the first place. Maybe it had always been about control, about reminding me that I owed her, that everything I had was because of her sacrifices. And as much as that thought hurt, it also pushed me forward, step by step, suitcase wheels bumping against the uneven floorboards, until I reached the front door, my heart thundering in my ears, and I half expected her to come storming after me, to shout something else, to demand I stop. But there was nothing, just that silence pressing down on me, and I realized she wasn't going to stop me, not this time, which scared me even more because part of me wanted her to. Part of me wanted some sign that she cared enough to fight, but instead there was only emptiness. And so I opened the door, stepped outside, and for the first time in years, the air felt different, lighter, like I had broken free of an invisible cage. Though the freedom was laced with fear, because as I stood there staring at the street I grew up on, I realized I had no real plan, nowhere certain to go, no idea what the next week of my life would look like. Yet somehow that uncertainty felt more honest than anything I had lived inside that house, and while I didn't know what would come next, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. Not after she told me to pack my things. Not after the way her voice cut through me like a blade. Because even if she hadn't meant it literally, I was done living in the shadow of words that bruised deeper than fists ever could. And with that thought, I took the first step down the driveway. The suitcase rattling behind me like a drumbeat, my heart answering in rhythm, telling me to keep going, even if my legs shook with every step. Hey through he as I dragged my suitcase further away from the house. Every step seemed to unlock a flood of memories that I had tried for years to bury, moments that came rushing back with such force that I felt like I was carrying not just clothes in that bag, but every argument, every slammed door, every tear I had shed alone in my room while pretending to be asleep so she wouldn't hear me. And it was strange, because leaving should have felt like cutting the cord cleanly, but instead it felt like ripping out roots that had been tangled so deeply into the soil of my life that I couldn't move without tearing parts of myself out too. And as I walked, I kept thinking about the small ways resentment had built up over time, the subtle digs at family dinners, the way she always reminded me how much money she spent on me, how often she would sigh loudly when paying bills, like I was a weight dragging her down. And even though I wanted to believe she loved me in her own way, those moments piled higher than any kindness I could remember. And now, dragging my suitcase in the fading light of the evening, I started to understand that love wasn't supposed to feel like a chain around your ankle, wasn't supposed to make you feel guilty for simply existing. And that realization burned hot in my chest, fueling the decision that would come later, the decision to cut ties in a way she would never see coming, by canceling the Autopay I had been running for her bills for years, a system she had come to rely on without ever really thanking me. And as I thought about it, I realized how twisted it was that she had made me feel like a dependent child all this time, when in reality, I was the one keeping so many pieces of her world afloat, the one making sure the lights stayed on, the internet kept running, the phone bills were paid, and yet she still spoke to me as if I was nothing more than a burden, a failure, someone who hadn't measured up to her standards. And the anger that rose in me as I walked was almost overwhelming, a bitter fire that made my throat ache. But at the same time, underneath it all, there was sorrow, a deep and aching grief for the family we could have been, the relationship I had once dreamed of having with her, one where I could call her not just my mother, but my friend, and realizing that dream was dead was its own kind of heartbreak, one that made my steps heavy even as I forced myself forward. One foot in front of the other, like I was learning to walk again, this time without the chains of her expectations holding me upright. Hey, the first night away from home didn't feel like freedom at all. It felt like wandering into a storm without an umbrella, like I had stepped out of one prison only to find myself in the middle of a wilderness where nothing was familiar, and though I told myself over and over again that leaving was the right choice, that I couldn't keep suffocating under the weight of my mother's control, the reality of being alone hit me in waves, crashing harder each hour as the night deepened, and I found myself sitting on the edge of a friend's couch, where I had been offered a temporary place to stay, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep because every creak of the old apartment sounded like doubt whispering in my ears, asking if I had made a mistake, if maybe I should have stayed quiet, swallowed the anger, and lived in that house a little longer. And yet the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that going back would only mean more of the same, more arguments that circled endlessly, more nights crying into my pillow while pretending everything was fine, and I couldn't bear the idea of wasting more of my life like that. So even in the thick of fear and loneliness, I forced myself to see this as the beginning of something, the fragile first step into a life I could shape myself. And with that thought came a strange flicker of determination that kept me awake, because I began replaying the years I had spent not only surviving in that house, but keeping it running in ways my mother refused to acknowledge. Like the countless hours I had spent organizing bills, setting up Autopay for the utilities, tracking due dates so that nothing got shut off. And the irony was brutal. She had been shouting at me to pack up and leave, but she never realized how much of her stability rested on the invisible work I did in the background. How many times I quietly fixed things so she wouldn't spiral into panic, and lying there on that couch I felt a sharp mixture of pain and power as I thought, maybe the most honest way to leave isn't just with a suitcase, but by pulling back the support she took for granted. Because maybe then she would understand that I wasn't just some dependent child, but the person who had been holding up more of her world than she wanted to admit. And the idea took root slowly, not yet a plan, but a whisper that told me real independence wasn't just about walking out the door. It was about reclaiming the energy and resources she had drained from me for years. Hey, Fifi. The day after I left, I woke up with the kind of heaviness that makes you question if moving forward is even possible. The kind of weight that presses on your chest before you even open your eyes. And for a moment, I just lay there on the borrowed mattress, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the occasional car passing outside, and I felt like I had been dropped into someone else's life, a stranger to myself, because all the routines I had been bound to were gone. The tension-filled breakfasts, the constant checking of my phone to see if a new list of chores had been texted to me. The way I used to time my steps in the hallway so I wouldn't trigger another lecture about how loudly I moved, and as strange as it sounds, the absence of those routines left a hollow echo in me, like I was waiting for a punchline to a joke that would never come. And yet, as the minutes stretched into hours, I began to notice a different kind of silence, one that didn't suffocate, but instead allowed me to breathe a little deeper. And that's when I realized that freedom isn't always a rush of adrenaline or fireworks in the sky. Sometimes it's just waking up and not being afraid of who's waiting outside your door. Sometimes it's the simple relief of knowing the first words you hear in the morning won't be shouted accusations. And that thought steadied me enough to sit up, rub the sleep from my eyes, and start thinking about what came next. Though, of course, the practical part of my mind quickly reminded me that I hadn't just walked away from my mother. I had also walked away from the structure of keeping her world intact, which meant that bills were coming due soon, payments scheduled on systems that I had set up, accounts linked to my information, and the memory of how much she depended on me for those things came crashing down with a strange clarity, because I suddenly saw that part of her anger when she told me to pack my things wasn't just emotional, it was fear disguised as fury. The fear of losing the person who quietly kept the machinery of her life running. And that realization didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It made me feel stronger, because for once I wasn't powerless. I wasn't just a child being sent away. I was someone who could decide whether or not to keep carrying a load that was never mine to carry in the first place. And the more I thought about it, the more the decision began to harden inside me. Not yet action, but the seed of rebellion that whispered, maybe you should let her feel the weight of her own world for once. Maybe you should stop protecting her from the consequences she never hesitated to throw at you. Chase 6V, the moment I actually logged into the account, my fingers hovering over the settings that controlled the Autopay system, I felt a tremor in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of technology, and everything to do with the weight of what this act symbolized, because for years those clicks and confirmations had been my invisible leash, the thing tethering me to her, no matter how badly she made me feel. And as I stared at the screen, I remembered every single time she had barked at me about being irresponsible, every sarcastic comment about how I would never survive on my own. And the cruel irony that behind the scenes it had been me making sure her electricity didn't shut off, her internet didn't go dark, her phone never lost service, and suddenly the bitterness I had carried for so long crystallized into something sharper, something almost electric. Because it wasn't just about money, it was about power, about realizing that in her attempt to control me she had overlooked how much she relied on me, and now here I was staring at the option that could sever that dependency in a single motion, and I knew some people might think it was petty or cruel, but to me it felt like the most honest response I could give, not words shouted back in anger, not tears shed behind a closed door, but a quiet, deliberate act that said, if you want me gone, then I'm really gone, not just my presence, but my labor, my patience, my invisible caretaking, all of it. And the thought steadied me even as my hands shook, because I knew that once I hit that button, there was no going back. She would feel the absence in ways far louder than my packed suitcase rolling down the driveway. And maybe for the first time in her life, she would be forced to confront how much of her stability had been built on the very person she dismissed as useless. And though a part of me still ached at the thought of hurting her, a larger part whispered that this was justice, that sometimes walking away isn't enough. Sometimes you have to take back the pieces of yourself you gave away for free, even if it leaves someone else scrambling. And so, with a deep breath that seemed to shake my entire body, I clicked. One simple click, and in that instant something inside me shifted forever. Her 7 in the days that followed after I canceled the Autopay. The silence between us transformed from a familiar Cold War into something more jagged, something that cut both ways. Because at first there were no calls, no texts, nothing at all, and I wondered if maybe she hadn't noticed yet, if maybe the payments would take a while to bounce back into her life. But then the messages started coming, not soft or apologetic, but sharp bursts of rage written in all caps, long strings of accusations that I was trying to ruin her, that I was ungrateful, selfish, a parasite who had turned on the very person who gave me everything. And though each word stung in its own way, I couldn't help but feel a strange and quiet strength threading through me as I read them, because for the first time in my life I wasn't rushing to fix it. I wasn't scrambling to restore the balance. I wasn't apologizing just to calm the storm. Instead, I let the storm rage. I let her words pile up on my phone without reply. And every vibration of another incoming message reminded me that she was finally dealing with the reality I had shouldered alone for so long, the reality of bills that didn't pay themselves, of deadlines that didn't move no matter how loudly you shouted, of responsibility that couldn't just be shoved onto someone else. And though part of me grieved the final unraveling of whatever thread connected us, another part of me felt like I was standing taller, breathing freer, as though I had stepped out of a costume I'd been forced to wear for years, the costume of the dutiful child who held everything together in silence. And now I was just myself, flawed, uncertain, but free in a way I had never known, and that freedom tasted bittersweet, because it came at the cost of a relationship I had once prayed would heal. But it also tasted like truth, and truth, no matter how bitter, has a way of setting you free.